We are now live on YouTube with the March 4th, 2019 out-of-band Node.js modules team extended meeting to resolve resolution of extensions. We're joined by 9 members of the team right now. We are just shy of 1 voting member for quorum. I will chime in if someone else joins and we reach quorum. In the meantime, to kind of get people up to date on where we're at, we had been recently going through figuring out what an implementation that we would be comfortable upstreaming to Node.js core would look like. I've just posted a link to that in the chat here, but it's https github.com Node.js modules blob master. Actually, you know what I could do really quickly? Let me go ahead and just share that screen with everyone. Just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, just making sure I'm not leaking anything. Okay, so this is the plan for the new modules implementation. We have now 3 phases. Before we had 4 phases. The biggest changes here were phases 0 and 1 kind of being broken out to see how we got to the minimal kernel. Phase 2, fleshing out everything that's needed for us to upstream the implementation. And phase 3 being everything that we will do on that upstream implementation in order to drop the experimental flag. We still have, you know, our main standards, our kind of guidelines for doing it, which is spec compliance, browser equivalence, and don't break CommonJS. We could kind of skip the fresh start in the phase 1 minimal kernel stuff. I think that, you know, as a group in general, we're pretty consistent with that. If anyone has questions, please feel free to chime in. And then phase 2 is where we're at right now. And we have, you know, some core functionality that we've reached consensus on, specifically defining the semantics for importing a package from an entry point, which right now is using main, although there's some other patterns that we're exploring, defining semantics for when to load sources as CommonJS or ES modules. This is also using the file specifier resolution proposal. This is introducing type field into the package JSON. Oh, we've got Saleh. We did it. And Gus. Okay, so we've got quorum for what it's worth. We've got quorum. Yay. Then defining semantics for enabling ESM treatment of source code loaded via eval SDN and extensionless files, both with and without shebang lines. Click through. And this landed in ECMAScript modules poll 32. And then there's kinds of loaders is here right now, although, you know, if we have time during this call, we may dig into that because, as I said, we have quorum. There may be a different path we'll take there. But specifically, the one that we have highlighted that we really need to dig into and find consensus on is add or decide not to support file extension and directory index searching in ESM. Then we have a variety of things that are inside of phase 3. Those have been deemed out of scope for the upstream implementation, but definitely things that need to be sorted out between now and when we remove the flag. For the sake of keeping things simple, let's just not dig into those today, although those are, you know, there to have. So we have this thread, which is a long, intense debate and discussion. I mean, by our team standards, it's actually not that long. Some of these threads get really, really long. But I wanted to kind of kick things off with a proposal that I think could maybe be palpable. I know some people may have issues with it. But what I'd like to suggest that we do moving forward, because we do not yet have consensus, is I would like to see an implementation of file extension searching as well as supporting index for folders, but I would like to see that put behind an additional flag. And to be kind of explicit about why I would like to see this and how it would be set up is, you know, we would be removing something that the current implementation can do. It is something that is controversial, and we definitely do not have consensus within the group that removing it or including it is something that we want to do. Now, with that being said, it is my personal belief that without it included, we leave open design space, whereas with it included, we remove design space. And Jordan, I see your hand, and I will get to you momentarily. The big thing that I would like to see done, and why I'm pushing towards including it with a flag, would be I want to allow the ecosystem to experiment with this. I want them to be able to play with it, to be able to see what works and what doesn't. And I also want to be able to have responses from the community to let us know how much or how little they want this feature, which I'm sure we will hear from people once this lands and they get their hands on it and get to play with it. My concern is that if we just don't have it in there at all, so no flag and no implementation, that we're not giving people any sort of opportunity to experiment and actually play with this workflow. Whereas alternatively, if we put it in without a flag, I don't think anyone will actually experiment with the workflow without the extension searching. So that is, my suggestion and a proposal that I'm willing to help, implement prior to landing. And with that, I'm going to hand it onto the floor to Jordan, who has their hand up.
Hi. Okay, so I had a couple thoughts while you were talking. One was most of the controversy typically is around things that are defaults and not so much capabilities. So I suspect that if we all were convinced that it did not alter the likelihoods of what would ship as default and what would not, that it would be completely uncontroversial to ship extension resolution behind a flag. However, because I think it does alter the calculus of what gets shipped behind flags does alter the calculus of what is likely to be shipped by default or not. So I think that may be the difficulty there. The other question is if we shipped extension resolution off by default and on with a flag, and you think that will encourage both experimentations, but you think that shipping it on by default and off with a flag would not, people would not experiment with the flag version. Doesn't that suggest which one has more desire?
So to speak to your 2 points, I'll speak to the latter one first. So the only reason why I think that people would experiment with it more with it off versus on would be like to your point about code just kind of transitioning. People already have code written that's expecting the flag to be on, and I think one of the things that we have as a disagreement is how much people really want that, how much workflow that's going to break, and whether or not it's going to be totally controversial. So I think to that point that you were asking about what people would choose, my gut is that we don't really know. And to me, off by default upstreaming seems to make the most sense. I also think that there's design space that we haven't figured out yet, and one in particular being dual mode modules. If we ship as it is right now with file extension resolution on by default, then we are shipping with a method of doing dual imports through leaving out the file extension in the main field. Whereas if we ship without file extensions on by default, that design space is still open. To your point on like defaults and capabilities, I really believe that turning this on later is something that I see no reason that we wouldn't offer as potentially even an application level loader. But I don't think that we have consensus whether or not it would be the default. And similar to what I was saying there about the dual mode modules, I think that we leave more design space open that way. But now I'm being repetitive, so I'll pass it to Guy.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that argument about, the polarity of this. I think that there's an important kind of point in terms of people already expect extensions searching to work. And what we're doing by removing it is saying, this is something that is under consideration. And we should be clear in that in the way that we communicate what it's doing there. But if we ship it with the same, then people are going to just assume that it's always going to remain that way. And to change it later would then be the taking the candy away from the baby sort of situation. Whereas if we make it clear now, we might get it, we might not, we don't know, then it kind of sets expectations much more clearly, I think, as well, because it's all about if we agree that these arguments all come down to conventions and what the defaults are and what users expect, that it's about managing those expectations. And that's why this way around makes more sense.
Thank you, Guy. Gus?
Hi. I have a few things to say, and they've kind of gotten jumbled up in the last few minutes, but I'll try to get through them all. Let's see, Myles, what were you saying right before Guy spoke?
I was specifically responding to Jordan's point about off by default versus on by default, and what people would be likely to use or not use, and what that may say about ecosystem.
Right. So on that specific point, the reason I raised my hand, in fact, was just to note, I made this enormous JavaScript engine written in JavaScript, and as an experiment, I have not used any form of resolution in any of the source files here, over 200 files, and I don't use directory resolution, and I don't use extension resolution, and my experience with that has been that it results in, I think there have been 3 times when I've needed to run a copy and replace regex over the entire code base to fix things resulting in that. That was my first point.
Do you consider that to be unacceptable or reasonable?
I don't know what other workflows exist for this, but I found it to be close to unacceptable. Obviously I was able to do it, but it was terrible. There was more I wanted to say. I need to take notes or something. I'll probably remember at some point.
So, Gus, to your point, my feeling is that, the intuition that you have and Jordan has, that we may just have to ship this whether we like it or not because of how much the ecosystem relies on it and how much the ecosystem needs it and what a pain in the butt it may be to transition code otherwise, I think is a very valid point. And I personally think that if we ship it behind a flag, we're going to get a signal extremely quickly from the community letting us know. My concern is kind of twofold. If we ship without anything, so no flag and no implementation, my concern is that we're going to get extreme pushback from the community and potentially even upstream when we try to land this upstream, that it's just not acceptable to not have it. Or, really, really strong pushback, similar to in defense of JS and some of the other stuff. I think shipping with a flag early on makes it really easy for people to opt into the experience they want, and they can give us that feedback that they prefer that use case. The flip side is if we just ship with it on, I don't think that we will be able to get that feedback. And I think that doing it this way is an opportunity for us to essentially do what we talked about doing with the ecosystem polls that we weren't really able to be super successful with. I think when we do our upstream implementation, we will kind of have this one shot to do kind of a bit of a press push around it, to do some evangelism over the new implementation and advocacy for people who are using it, and kind of bring in all of that feedback to then help us iterate what we want to do moving forward. And while it may be, creating more friction by putting it behind a flag, I actually think that friction is a feature from a user design and research perspective, because it will give us that explicit feedback. And if we do it and we find that we have tons and tons of pushback, it may only be, a couple weeks when we're at the point that we decide to maybe remove the flag and make it the default, if that's the direction that we decide to go. Jay Dalton?
Hi. So the flag idea is interesting, and the feedback idea is interesting. Does Node have any precedent for being able to opt into telemetry for flag use? Is that something we could do?
It I've been talking with a few people about how ways we could collect telemetry, but right now there's absolutely nothing we have by means of collecting telemetry.
Because that would be neat if we could do that.
Can I just add a point to that? One way we could theoretically do it is like to survey GitHub to see like npm run scripts to see like how often do you see node space dash dash something or other.
Yeah,
it'd be a slow process, but we could get some data that way.
Yeah, there's a Google BigQuery. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, so we definitely could do some digging with BigQuery. We could definitely do like user outreach. There's like the community committee that does their user outreach. But yeah, JD, it's not really on the table to do telemetry right now. I think that that's a great thing to bring up and discuss upstream, but I think any sort of thing like that is going to be controversial and require lots of work and won't really work with our timeline.
Oh, that's okay. Even doing a BigQuery is great. Having a way to sniff it out. Yeah. No, that's fine.
Yeah, and I can definitely help with that. And I have some work that I've done previously that scans that. And I know Jeff has done some also like ecosystem scanning work. Kevin?
Yeah, so I would simply caution that the design space I don't think is quite as open as we may like it to be. So what I mean by that is there's a lot of different choices that you can make for doing resolution, but once you start making choices that make it similar in some ways to the current resolution semantics, then I think you'll find, in your design, you find yourself being attracted to just doing, the current CJS resolution semantics altogether almost. And then, there's the other approach of going in a completely different direction. Like that would be like something like exports maps. But I think, if we did have a flag that might lead the process in one direction rather than another. That's it.
Okay, Jordan?
Yeah, just so what are we trying to achieve with user feedback here? Because I think it's going to be, I think that there will be, that it should be taken as a given that there will be non-zero people, some of whom are on this call, who will find their workflows seriously impeded without extension resolution on. So what are you expecting to get? I mean, I can imagine that one outcome could be a bunch of people complaining, but another outcome could be there's a bunch of people saying, well, this is fine. My workflow is not impacted, but zero of them, like it doesn't matter how many of people say their workflow is not impacted, that doesn't alter in any way how many people's workflow is impacted. So I guess I'm just curious, what are we expecting to get out of this feedback-wise?
So my intention and thoughts here would be that we would see how strong the reaction from both the community and upstream is. If you looked at something like MJS, for example, I think it's extremely clear how people feel about it. But with that being said, as a group, we've reached consensus that it's needed for our design. So we've moved forward with it anyways, but also found ways to appease, the complaints that people brought forward. And I think it's possible, and I think this is what you're alluding to, that the feedback that we get may not really be entirely actionable. But I do think that it will give us more information to work on than what we have today. And we may see also positive feedback for the change if people are really in support of it. So I think Jordan.
Right, but no amount of positive feedback will change the fact that there are, that will change the number of people that complain that their workflows don't work. And it doesn't matter how many people like the feature being off. If there are people who say, if this feature is off, I can't get my work done.
Yes.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's also people whose workflow is impacted by this feature being on. And those are the people who are trying to use NPM modules on the web, like something like Lodash.es, et cetera, all the NPM modules that are published to the web with this that therefore can't be used directly in a web ESM environment without some kind of build step or
Sure,
conversion
but
process. So we might
that's
very
an
well
existing
receive
problem.
feedback from those people saying, hey, thank you for pushing the community in this direction, pushing people to publish NPM modules that have explicit extensions baked in so that we don't have to go through these like build steps and so on in order to use them outside of Node.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That's some of the feedback we will get for sure. But that's a problem those people already have. They're already fighting the ecosystem there. And if that's something they want fixed, they can go to those packages and say, hey, could you internally in your package at least use extensions, and then that'll fix my use case. And since that hasn't happened, there clearly isn't enough persuasive arguments or desire to support that use case in the ecosystem. So I'm not sure why we should be forcing some users that already have working workflows to have those workflows not work solely to accommodate some people that haven't managed yet to convince the ecosystem that their use case is worth the inconvenience.
I'm just Jeffrey. So about this thing where there could be like some future where your node modules can be served directly from like without like I don't even like directly off a web server. I don't think that's like possible. You'll always need to at least scan over your node modules because there could be common JS in there. There could be, you know, node native modules in there. I don't think there's a future where you can consider node modules safe.
There are people already doing that.
No,
it's already happening.
Yeah, but it's never going to be non-zero. There are like 750,000 modules on NPM, and so there's always a chance you're going to need to bundle it. I don't think there's a point in designing like pushing the ecosystem into this flow that's never going to be possible. Like with my like being a spec person hat on, I would love if everyone used the same thing, but as like a node user, it's just like impossible.
And more to the point, I don't think it's in our place to try and impose that change on the ecosystem by way of getting, you know, like sneaking that in alongside a new module system. Like that's something that if we can't persuade everyone, like a critical mass of people to go in that direction already, then it probably doesn't deserve like first-class support.
Jordan, I mean, you could arguably say that we're sneaking in legacy Node.js behavior into a new module system as well. So I think that argument
already has a critical mass. So that is already de facto good because it's used by so many people.
Kevin, you have your hand up?
Yeah, kind of forgot what I was going to say though.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, so the feedback that we may get from this might depend to a high degree on the messaging like around it. So I think you pointed that out, but like if the messaging is, oh, you know, we've redesigned module support in Node, and I hope you like it. And if you want to try out this other thing, here's another flag. I think we can kind of predict that they'll take a look at it and they'll compare it to the experience that they get with, you know, the ESM package or Babel, and they'll feel like things are missing based on that comparison. You know, and that was kind of like to try to make some sort of attempt to get away from that comparison was, you know, part of the drive to create the web modules for Node idea, which is like telling a different story about it, to try and get around some of those expectations. But that's the idea anyway. And that's it. I just think that we can kind of, if we present it without a new story, I think we can kind of predict the feedback that we'll get.
Gus, did you have something more to add? Guy?
Yeah, a couple of things. Firstly, on the user feedback points, I think it's worth noting that as you mentioned, Myles, the feedback we get is not what drives this decision. Like with MJS, it's our decision as a group, how things go forward here. But the point is that we will have more information at that time that we make that decision. And there are many other factors that play into this decision. And to state a strong argument like Gus does, that it is impossible to make Node modules work in a browser, is a very strong opinion without evidence.
You can go, like are you saying that there's no evidence that all of the modules on NPM are browser compatible?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gus, right out the bat, you could use something like unpackage and an import map, and
yeah, that's a bundler. That's a bundler, and
you could do that with extension resolution too.
But you can do that without requiring to bundle the code on your end by having a fallback to pre-bundled modules over a CDN.
Yeah, so unpackage can do extension resolution. I'm sure they already do that because they're bundling common JS and whatnot.
Right,
they don't actually already do it. They have to make they opt into. You have to send a special flag, and then they like rewrite the code.
I could ask Michael to write that code. I could write it for him. That's not a hard problem to solve.
Anyway,
I think you missed the point that I was trying to get across there. It was not about how Unpackage does it or how other people do it. It was that if I'm writing code locally and I have npm install the module, I can have a fallback to Unpackage to allow a non-build based tree that just works for the modules that do not work properly due to local dependencies. I'm not saying that's the perfect solution. I'm just saying that's a proof of concept that I could put together today with an import map for the most part.
Right, that is still bundling though, right? Like
no, because your app does not need to bundle to be deployed.
Yeah, but someone is still doing the bundling for these packages that won't by default work in ESM. So I don't understand how that is somehow like getting rid of the problem. You've just pushed the problem onto some service. Yeah.
If I can step back though, because I think we're getting a little bit into the muck.
Can I just get back to my point as well there? When I was making that point, my point was that it's not an obvious point, and that we should be careful when dealing with such a complex design space where we're moving into new workflows that we're all working out collectively, and these workflows are being worked out every day. New things are happening on the web that are affecting the way that the entire ecosystem is going to work. And to deny that the entire ecosystem is shifting is also a mistake. So we have to keep an eye on where things are going. We have to keep an eye on where things are. But where we sit in the middle is a very, very difficult thing to predict. And I guess the point is that we will have more information in 3 to 6 months' time to be able to fully investigate these kinds of problems. I'm sure, I mean, there's projects coming out, you see like Pika, things like that. The space will continue to have innovations being made that will change the landscape. And we should not close that design space off. So it's more about the fact that like in a complex design space, we should defer the decisions until we have as much information as possible.
So I think kind of building on what Guy just said, you know, I think that choosing to put it on does make certain decisions about the design space, about things that we haven't explicitly figured out, and one in particular being dual mode modules. And so I think that including it behind a flag for this iteration and keeping it very, very clear that we're exploring that we have not made a decision, that it's something that we can add later, allows people to experiment with all of the different workflows and allows us to keep the most design space open. Saleh?
So I'm just going to bring one example, my own personal experience with requiring .mjs and experimental. So the way resolutions worked with a loader is you could do whatever you want. You could bring in extension matching. You could do whatever you want, even before it was possible to do that in experimental. Just the fact that I could not resolve without .mjs early on changed all the tools that I was relying on. And it forced me to at least explore different workflows than the ones I was used to, or one at that point. The insights I got, shocked me personally. I went into directions I did not think I was going to ever explore. I guess a year and a half later, I think we have to be very careful about saying because it worked, it will continue to work. And because people didn't show favor, towards going that direction before, that they will never go in that direction. I think while we're doing experimental, it's fair to say that we should get as much insight as possible. And I think how Myles proposes that this would be a opt-in, a conscious decision made by certain people who need to continue using their workflows, or consciously not made, and exploring new workflows is a very good way to ensure that whoever's experimenting knows where they, which path they would like to see this move forward. So when they actually express it to us, we're getting a more complete picture, a more articulated picture on which aspects work and what alternatives worked out for them as well. I guess that's it.
Thank you. Gus?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add that we can ship, or we can enable extension searching without it enabling dual mode by changing around the order of some things in the CommonJS loader. I have a patch locally that does that. So if we want to go that route, it can be done.
Okay, I'd personally prefer us not making any changes to that loader with our implementation. It seems like that may be controversial upstream, but that's just my personal opinion on it. We're 40 minutes into the meeting. We have 20 minutes left. And since we do have quorum here, it would be nice to dig into some other stuff if it's possible. Based on the conversation that we've had, do we have consensus on moving forward with this behind a flag for the upstream? Does anyone object to that as an approach? I'm being quiet for an extra long time, just in case anyone's having trouble with their mute button.
Clarifying what's behind the flag.
Take it. Take the consensus and run.
Just wanted to clarify that, this is not, this is still a question we have to resolve before unflagging at the very least. You're just talking about phase 2, not phase 3, right?
Yeah, we'll update phase 3 to state that this consensus needs to be figured out. We're putting it behind a flag for the upstream so that, as much of the design space as possible is left open, that all these different workflows can be experimented with. And, I think, and this is something that we'll dig into in the next meeting, that as we upstream this, we're going to have to probably reevaluate how we work as a group a little bit to kind of tackle these independent problems and our workflow. But this will be kind of one of the highest priority items for us to dig into. And I think it's also it's interconnected with a lot of things like the exports proposal, Jordan, your extensions resolution proposal. I think that there's kind of this whole other wave of changes that we're going to need to make that are all interconnected here, that making a decision on this in particular will inform.
So could we ship 2 flags, one that explicitly turns the resolution on and one that explicitly turns it off? And that way, that's a path for, if we change the default, anyone who depends on not having resolution can have already opted into that.
What happens if you don't pass either flag?
Then it would be the default, which at the moment would be none. I suppose we could make it throw, but that seems unnecessarily restrictive.
So you just want to whitelist the flag in advance and just have a no-op flag?
Yeah, I want to essentially have a on and an off flag and have the default be one of those two. I think in general, that's better than shipping one flag and then forcing a bunch of churn if you want to change the default.
How about a single flag that has a true false value? Would that like, it could be for now, like extension resolution or like node extension resolution, true or false?
I mean, yeah, we can bike shed the name because the extension doesn't imply that it also includes directory, but like some sort of -- resolution or -- no resolution. But yeah, we can bike shed it later. I just wanted to get
could it be, it would be similar to how we have -- type equals common.js now, which basically achieves nothing, but
yes,
you know, it's there for this potential future where the default flips.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Just the kind of general API design where defaults always have an explicit variant of the default.
Yeah.
So it'd still be one flag, but just take an argument of like on or off or something like that.
We can bike shed the details of that, but it'll either be two flags or one flag with different enum values or whatever. But,
perfect. Cool. I was just asking to make sure because I think it would be probably more flexible to have a single flag with multiple options than multiple flags. But yeah, let's kick that to the issue. So no one objects to us moving forward with this, assuming that the flag that we choose puts things on at least an equal footing from like a compatibility standpoint. Excellent. Thank you all so much for being very reasonable about all of this. We're actually going to ship something with basically no votes, which is like absurdly awesome. The last thing that I wanted to get into right now, if people have time in the last couple minutes, is there was kind of two issues that got opened recently. One is against ECMAScript modules, and this is a pull request from Guy. It's specifically number 47. I just dropped that into the chat. And then we can also talk about number 286 afterwards if we have time. What number 47 does is reverts the commit that we had that removed the loader API from our implementation. For extra context, you know, Brad's baby arrived, and Brad is going to have limited time to help the project, at the very least in the immediate near future. And Guy and I were talking earlier today just about kind of how we could approach this. And it felt to both of us after discussing it that there wasn't really a way to move forward with the new loaders implementation and land it based on the timeline that we're talking about without either A, making decisions that Brad would not really have time to reflect on, or B, having something that we want to implement that we don't really have, you know, the time or volunteers to implement. So what we suggested was moving the new loaders implementation to phase 3. And we have this that removes, that adds back the old loader implementation that currently exists upstream, but will introduce an extra warning when you use it the first time, similar to like using fs.promises, that kind of screams at you and says, hey, you're using a deprecated loader implementation. It will be replaced, so that, you know, people know, but we're not breaking current workflows that people are using. That way we can start iterating on the loaders API that I know Guy and Jan and Brad and people have been implementing and working on without rushing it, or without kind of, you know, I just want to make sure that we have time for getting the right consensus around it before we change things. Does anyone object to doing that as a way to move forward? Cool. So with that being said, we have the loader pull request that's open. I have a comment in here asking Guy to just add in that deprecated comment, and we will document it as deprecated in the docs. Let me just document that. I added a comment about that. Does anyone object to us landing this, let's say by like Wednesday or Thursday, assuming that there's no objections in the pull request? Very, very cool. So with that being said, I want to spend the last little bit of time that we have reviewing this one last doc, which I put together really quickly. And so apologies if anyone has any problems with how this has been reflected. And I just want to get feedback and see if we can reach consensus around this, because if we can, we may be in a really, really great place to meet the timelines that we're talking about. So I went through and worked backwards from the targeted release date of V12 to come up with, hey, what should we do and what's the timeline that we're looking at? So we have a targeted release date for V12 of April 23rd. Based on that, I set April 11th as a go, no-go date. Essentially, if we can't reach consensus upstream on landing it by April 11th, it likely won't be able to go in 12. This is a pretty big change, and we likely want to have enough stuff, enough time for that to sit before landing. I set a target date of April 4th as the date that we'd like to land it upstream, and that's based on April 20th as the date that we actually open it. So rolling back, I went kind of backwards. Let's start from forward. Today is the 4th. This is say that March 13th, which is next Wednesday, we should have everything in, including, I guess, the 2 pull requests that we talked about, the one that's open right now to reland loaders, as well as the other one that we need to land to add the modules. And we'll get down to like exactly what needs to be done, but that essentially we should try to get all of that work done for the most part by the 13th, or at least enough by the 13th that we can, in a group, just say, hey, this is what we're sending. That on the 20th, we would open the pull request upstream and begin getting reviews. That the 27th which would be our next modules meeting, we could review the upstream concerns if necessary and come up with a plan to iterate. That would then give us until April 4th, which is the following date, to target to land it upstream, with April 11th, a week following that, be kind of the cutoff date. So that gives us more or less, a little bit over a month from today, about 5 weeks from today, as kind of like the timeline to see this landed upstream in core. Before I move on to like what we would need to do to get there, does anyone have any concerns or thoughts around those particular dates?
So the type equals ESM or mode ES, whatever it's called now, that thing was merged, but I tried to make it pretty clear during that I still wanted a more general solution, and it would be great if we could include some agreed upon version of the extensions map thing I posted, within the next few weeks. But in general, the dates seem fine. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about later or not.
Okay. Jan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm assuming this means mostly just that once it lands upstream, all changes need to go through the upstream process, but otherwise there's no special meaning to this landing in terms of what can still go in and what cannot go in, right?
Yeah, so there's nothing special. I think that once we reach consensus on landing things upstream, we're going to have to kind of sit down and start to think about what it means for us to continue to work on this. If we want to continue to work in a fork, if we want to keep the moratorium upstream, if we want to drop the moratorium, if we want to create like smaller teams to work on specific things, if we want to charter, I think there's a whole slew of other kind of governance and workflow related questions for us to answer at that point once we've done it. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't just upstream our monolith, for lack of a better way to put it, and then iterate when we get there. Does that answer your question? I see a thumbs up in the chat, so I'll just assume that that's an okay. And then Jordan, to your point about the extension maps, I guess my only thought regarding them is our current consensus on phase 2 did not include those as a phase 2 item. We can still add that. I see no reason why, if it's implemented, if we have consensus and we want to land it before upstreaming, that we couldn't. On the same note, I see no reason why we couldn't upstream without it and then immediately iterate and try to get it in as soon as possible afterwards, because especially once we have that new implementation, We may still want to work on our fork to reach consensus before sending things upstream, but we may not have to wait, like as long of a time because we'll be doing smaller pushes.
My concern is that we may want to reevaluate, like what we have landed now is a sugar for a single specialized subset of what my proposal is attempting to address. So I'm wondering, we may want to reevaluate whether that sugar, it should exist or should exist in that form when the more generalized solution is agreed upon. So I'm a little less confident that we'll be able to rip out that sugar that lives in published packages, even though it's an experimental behind the flag implementation. If we're all completely content to do that at any point, not just at the next major version of Node, then there's probably no concern. But I'm not convinced that everyone will be as cavalier about doing that, unfortunately.
I am not only 100% content, but 100% convinced that we will have to do that anyways at some point as we work out on spaces that we're in right now.
Okay.
Like especially when we're talking about dual mode modules or about like extensions or even loaders, as we figure out these things, the design space is going to keep shifting. I don't see a future where what we upstream right now mirrors exactly what we unflag anyways. So I'm imagining a couple breaking changes between now and then. I'm just hoping that they are, at a faster pace and a faster waterfall than we've done for this first batch. But I think there was a lot of consensus seeking that we needed to do to reach here. I think future iterations are going to happen, far faster than the iteration cycle that we've had just now. Does that appease your concern?
Hopefully. We'll have to see.
Fair enough. So what I have outlined here is what we need to get done before upstreaming is finalized phase 2 in the planning document. So that's sending the updates for moving loaders, the update for how we're handling extensions and moving those that need to be moved to phase 3 and reaching consensus on that in the next meeting. So Jordan, for what it's worth, also, if you think that we need to add this to phase 2, this is your opportunity to try to do that. I think that we can make this work either way, though. We need a decision and implementation of loaders for phase 2, which I believe we have, some pull requests in place to try to implement, and I'll add those. We need a decision and implementation of file extensions, which I think that we reached a decision today, but we need an implementation for that to land. We need to update all the documentation to reflect the latest implementation. I believe that that's something that Jeffrey is working on, although, anyone who wants to chip in is very much welcome to do so. We need to do a final code.
And I could use some help on that. So please, please reach out.
We need to do a final code test and doc review, which will also include deciding, hey, do we want to squash this all into one commit? Do we want to break it up into multiple commits? And just kind of figuring out what the final, what we actually upstream looks like and keeping it, reasonable from a review standpoint. We're going to need to work and determine the messaging around the upstream pull request and how we're going to be presenting it to the team. We need to open the upstream pull request, and we also need to write copy about what our group has been doing and all the current progress and status for public blog posts and communications. We'd likely want to do something through the Foundation's Medium. We'll potentially want to tweet about this. We want to get the word out. So, we're going to want to have a collective message that we're all on the same page about. Is there anything that I didn't include in this list that people think we would need before upstreaming, or alternatively things that are included here that seem out of scope?
Yeah, like you said, Myles, I would like the opportunity to try and get agreement on the extensions map. I think I'm less concerned about getting the implementation landed first, as much as getting the consensus on doing it.
Yeah, well, we could at the very least get consensus and documentation of it as a phase 3 item. I think that will be completely uncontroversial, and I'm happy
if that includes agreement on the shape of the user visible shape of the implementation, then I'm very happy with that.
Okay, so how about you and I find some time out of band of this meeting to try to see if we can come up with a proposal or something before next Wednesday.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything?
So I think that we already had the PR to move the loaders to phase 3. I think the planning doc then needs just an update to change the file extension resolution thing to say that we're adding it but behind a flag. Am I correct in assuming that? And if I were to put up such a PR, I'm assuming that would have consensus from everybody?
That seems reasonable to me. Any objections to that? If I could suggest one thing, I'd like to suggest, since we do have a pretty explicit plan here of what we want to do, does anyone object to us temporarily augmenting the rules that we have for landing PRs on both modules and ECMAScript modules, that anything that's open for at least 48 hours and has at least 2 reviews on it can land? Assuming that next Wednesday we're going to be trying to review the whole thing. I think that will help us have a little bit more velocity and get everything done so we can actually review the whole thing next Wednesday. Does anyone object to that?
As long as anything that didn't achieve quorum on the PR is expected, or like it's completely fine to revert it in the later meeting, that seems like a great way to make things faster. I
mean, with the exception that I don't want like new features slipped in, like the extension map. Sure, we can add it, but I don't want that to just like go through with 48 hours and so on.
Yeah, well, and with what I said, if it did, it would be completely eligible for being reverted if like it did not achieve quorum at the next meeting.
To be very explicit about what I was just stating was everything that fell in this list and only this list. So Jordan, I don't think extension maps would fall within.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that anyway. This list seems like a fine restriction, with the caveat I mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So does anyone have any problems with that? I think that will help us get everything ready by next Wednesday.
That seems fine.
Okay, great, everyone. We've designed a module loading system. Congratulations, you're all winners. Okay, cool. Does anyone have any last minute stuff to add to the call, or are we good to move forward based on this? Okay, great. Y'all, we literally just reached consensus. And although we did kind of vote before, it was there. I'm going to pretend that vote didn't happen because it didn't really affect things too much. We did it without votes. We did it with consensus. Y'all should be really proud of yourselves because we all have a lot of different opinions, and it's required everyone to make concessions and to work within everyone else's, with having everyone else's stuff in mind. And, this is not easy to do. Thank you all for being so flexible and for helping us get here. And I didn't get caught off during my motivational end meeting speech this time. So,
yes. I was really waiting for it. I was like, there's only one way this could get even better is if Myles gets cut off mid-word.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to end the YouTube stream. Thank you, everyone who tuned in.